kids, welcome to Sal's Rumble Riggy Time thing. This is sort of a rigging day. Okay, so newsy news stuff first. The Scriptor Master Controller has been updated. So in the past, boop boop, this associated slider to two keyframes thing that was in progress, it is now ready. So what you can do is have a little thing, let's say this is an eyebrow or an expression, any sort of two pose thing. You can select your master controller, hit Shift F11, associate a slider to two keyframes, and then you've got this guy here. So we want keyframe frame 1 and frame 2. Select frame 1, and then the next frame, so you need to have them adjacent, so it'll look for the frame plus 1. So just kind of smush your two keys together, and then select the ones that you want. Let's just say this deformer, generate a slider. Now when we hit Shift F11, we'll get a little dealy and we'll be able to schmoodly go back and forth. So any of your slider needs, you can do that. Anything that's keyframeable as far as I know. So go and play with that. I'll put the link to the Gumroad down below and you can go and have a good time with all your slidery needs. Okay, so today I wanted to play a little bit with texture. First, we'll just set up a little dealy with a green screen because we're going to replace this green screen with a texture. Now, you can get your textures anywhere. Bloop. I get my textures from www.textures.com. This is a really good site for anybody who uses textures. They've got all sorts of fabrics and stuff, and you get 15 free credits a day to download free textures. So since I need a texture about once every 6 months, it's a really good deal for me to get some free textures there. Bloop. So what I'm going to do is import the image. You could use your little dealy here. I'm going to sneakily grab it out of my downloads folder without you seeing all my NDA that I keep in there. And I like to use a new preset. So in here in your vectorized parameters, because I'm going to use a vectorized texture, I'm going to hit in the output here, color is texture, and then I'm going to hit OK. So there's a ton of other little things in here. If you're going to try and import bitmap images, then you can try and transfer it without too many vector points, things like that. But if you're importing the color as a texture, you don't need to worry about any of that. You're going to get this pop-up that says your color is broken, do you want to fix it? And you say yes, and it's going to link that texture. So now I've got this adorable tea towel, I think it is, some sort of a plaid, and I'm going to rename it plaid because this is big. So I'm doing this in 15, but you can do it in pretty much anything. So there's a million ways you can decide on how to get your plaid to work here. What I'm going to do is just separate my line from my color art like this. So now my green screen is going to be on the color art layer, and then I'm going to use layer selector. So this is one way. Now I can do this and grab my cutter, and now I can use the color art here to mask my plaid and invert it. So sometimes you see a texture and the object is moving, but the texture is staying the same, which is what we're seeing here. It's acting as a spyglass. So usually you use a much larger texture, or it'll be a very uniform texture, and the character is walking along, but their texture is staying in place. So that's relatively easy to do in Harmony because it's a node-based system. All you have to do is just not connect your texture to your mask. So now I can either move my texture to make sure that it's in the scene. So here we need to fill the entire screen. The whole camera's filled up with texture, and then our little character could walk along and their plaid is going to stay in place. So that's kind of a neat look for shows, but it's pretty niche. It's not something you see most of the time. Usually it'd be more like this, where the character's wearing a plaid shirt and then the mask is controlling the plaid here. So now when we move our guy, it's going to move our texture as well. That's fairly simple. Now, the tricky part with textures is it doesn't like to work well with things like deformers. So here I'm just going to set up my curve deformer on my mask, and then I'm going to connect it to my plaid, and we're going to see how that looks. So if I bend my guy like this, it's actually working not too badly. That looks pretty good. Now, that doesn't look so good. It's interesting. But if we're going to be animating it, you can see parts of it are breaking into other pieces. They're cracking your texture. So this is something you have to be very aware of if you're designing with texture. And something that often gets to the rigging stage, and then the rigger has to have a small fit and explain to people why this is not a good solution for an elbow, for example. Because there's no happy way to take a complex texture like this and then crack it. like bend it. It's going to have a crack in it. All right, so now I've got our little elbow here. I'm gonna set it up so our joint is all lined up like this. All right, so when we bend it, it's looking pretty okay until we reach a certain threshold. And then we start cutting over the top of itself there. And, turn back to our curve. Make sure it's pulling our plaid along. We're gonna find that we're having some issues sometimes. All right, so it can be a little bit tricky trying to animate a character with a texture that's built into something like an elbow or a sleeve, because most of the time you're breaking your arms up into two pieces, and that's going to cause problems. So you have to decide you have to kind of decide how much you're willing to let go on that elbow joint there. All right, so here we have a typical elbow, and the tricky part here is that the texture is only going to be able to follow one part of the arm or the other. Like here it's connected to the top part of the arm, the upper arm we'll say, but then when the lower arm bends, first if we select here, it's going to select the texture. And if we select this guy here and we bend it, then it's not going to bend the texture. So this is one place where bone deformers might be a better solution than a traditional sort of broken up rig, which of course has its own problems, as we all know. Another solution could be to actually create two versions of the texture, and then you could have this guy's color art control this texture. And we're going to be needing a whole bunch of rigging to get this sorted. So I've quickly done up an elbow so that each one has its own texture, and we're getting these huge bounding boxes, but the good thing about using vectorized textures is I can actually crop this down. So you can't see the texture because it's being cropped right now, but you can create a smaller box. And if I just take the plaid outside here, you can see what that's actually doing. It's just cutting down the size of the drawing while it's not touching the texture at all. The texture is used as a fill, like a paint bucket fill. So it's really flexible and great. You can shrink these guys down. So if you did have something built this sort of a shape, you don't have to deal with gigantic bounding boxes. All right, so now I've got this guy. So again, selecting the texture is going to select the texture, but we can select up by hitting B and going up our hierarchy. But you're going to get jointed textures like this. So that's a call that you have to make. Having separated joints like this does make overlapping much easier, and animation is more flexible. You can do things like shrink down your arm if you're doing perspective, but all this stuff is going to be a little bit more difficult with textures. This is one of the few cases where I think bone deformers work a little bit better, and you can get around some of the problems there, but I think we all know how I feel about bone deformers. So whenever you're doing something with a lot of texture in 2D, you kind of have to make allowances. You have to decide what's important to you. Is a clean joint here important to you? Maybe play around with deformers and see how much you can get away with there. If having segmented joints like this is okay style-wise for you, then you could do something like this, or you could design your character knowing that you're going to have texture involved and avoid joints. And that's really, for the most part, what they tried to do. So it's rare that you'll see any sort of stripe on an arm. Sometimes you'll have a character like this with some pants, and they'll put a stripe down the pants like this. And then usually the stripe itself is separated either into two pieces here and here, or it'll be one long piece that's run through a deformer. So just to make things painful, let's play around with taking this texture and putting it into this shirt. So we're definitely going to have problems with the joints if we separate the texture onto each of these pieces. One thing we could do by having this image as a texture, we can actually use it as a paintbrush. So here I'm going to go to my tool properties, grab my paintbrush, and I'm going to use this tool, which is the repaint brush, and we can paint the texture in there. So it's going to be the exact size and shape of the guy we have already, the sleeve, bloop. So it's going to be cropped. Of course, here, because we have all these different pieces, we're definitely going to have some issues because we have shoulder pieces and the chest will have some. So this is what, if we just paint straight in, this is what we're going to end up with. And you can see some of the tricks I use to get these shoulders working. And it's definitely not ideal. Our torso deformer, because we're not using envelope deformer, which I think is a horrible thing that most places choose to do, is envelope deformers because they're so inflexible. Our chest is going to work pretty well here. We're not going to get too much distortion on it, even if we're doing some crazy stuff. But we're going to have problems here with this shoulder. I mean, it could definitely be a style choice to go this route, but I don't think it's going to be what we want for blue. Blue. So if we wanted to have blue run around and just have the texture show up when his shirt is there, what you might think is by grabbing a color override and then just selecting his shirt color as a mask. So we're going to render the selected colors only, bloop, and we're going to apply to matte outports, input effects. So this is saying that we can use this color as a matte, and we can grab, here's body, and we're also going to need his arms. So now if we just take this as a display, right now it says render all, we're going to switch this to render selected colors. So this is going to give us a matte of our character, and we can take just a simple drawing here, and I'm going to connect it to the torso, the chest, because that seems like the logical place that the texture should follow along. And like I said, you can just paint with this color now, and you can use your gradient editor here, because our texture, when we painted it, it didn't really know where to start, so it's kind of become giant and way over to one side. So that's fixable. You just bring this in, and we'll say we want a shirt to look like that. So this guy's only going to be visible when the shirt color is available. So this seems like a good idea at the time. So then we just have to plug it in high enough. So this is the result we get if we do that. We just use the shirt color as a single cutter to our entire thing. We'd need to then cut it as well using other pieces. So there'd be a lot more work involved. So for example, we'd have to cut it with our collar, because right now we can't see our collar, so we have to put that in there. And then we'd have to make sure that the line art here was working. So we'd have to bring it back behind the line art of the torso and stuff like that. So there'd be a lot of steps to getting it integrated by using one big piece that way. What we can do is keep that color override. Once we have it, we'll just shorten it down to CO. And we're going to put it on every single piece that we want. So this guy and this guy and this guy, and then the shoulders individually. And then we're going to create like little pockets of texture. And we can choose at that point, once we have all our masks, how we want to control our texture. So we put a color override on our chest and a cutter. And then we want to see where the chest is. In this case, it's being displayed right here. And we want our cutter to be just above that. And then our texture is going to be plugged in here. All right, so there we go. We got our color override from our chest and our texture here. All right, so we can see once we have this in, we need our collar to cut this as well. So we're going to need another cutter. The collar line art is going to cut the texture. So there we go. We've got our shirt texture working, and it's only slightly painful, as textures tend to be. The next thing I'm going to do is the shoulders. Boop. So I'm going to copy my color override on my cutter. And the shoulders conveniently are right next to the chest. So even though these are sharing a composite, I still want to give them each their own setup anyway, because Z-axis stuff might mess it up. So because this has an independent peg and this one does as well, we want to make sure that the information is coming out in our texture. So we'll put that in front of this guy here. We want the color override from here, and we're going to share this texture from our chest. So now, even though this shoulder can move independently and it's doing stuff, it's going to have the same texture as the chest here. But here we have to think about, when I'm moving this shoulder now, I'm going to be getting additional texture because this chest has its own setup, and the same thing is going to happen as well with the sleeves. So here we also need this cutter, and we're going to cut it with that. Let's do the same thing here. This is getting pretty cluttered. Hopefully this isn't like completely bonkers. This is very rig-centric. This guy's cutting here. So the next thing we want to do is bring that over to our upper arm, to our sleeve. And we're going to take a look in our drawing node, and our color art is where we want that. So right now we have a line art and a color art coming out of our sleeve. We need to isolate the color art there. So I'm going to bring in some layer selectors, boop, boop, and I'm going to change this line art color art to 2 separate ones. So then we're going to grab our sleeve, and you might be asking, like, why didn't you just use the color override here? So both of these, I mean, the green is going to come out anyway, and it's because I want the line art to be ahead of the texture. The color art actually doesn't need to be displayed at all once we have our texture plugged in. So our texture is just over here. We plug it in, but we want our line art to be ahead of that visually. And then we can grab this setup here. Need that one. Put it on the other guy. Line art, color art. We're going to turn into a line art and a color art. We're going to bloop, get rid of that, put that in there, and bring our texture over there. Huzzah! So now we've done that. We've got our texture in, and you can see that we're having Z-axis issues because we're using one texture. So there are a few ways to go about this. So here are some issues with doing it this way. We have our arm rotating and our texture staying in place. And then if we want to rotate our character, our texture is going to move, and that looks kind of good. But you can see we're definitely getting some weird issues with the texture here, sliding along the shoulders. This Z-axis issue, so we could use an apply peg transformation to control the Z-axis here. So this part of the texture, we can put an apply peg there, and then we can just check our Z-axis of our dude here, 0.0002. So now this is coming above there, this display. And then as we rotate, our texture is going to stay still because it's not hooked up to the shoulder, but it's going to maintain the appropriate Z-axis for that limb. That was an apply peg transformation on the texture itself. Of course, if you change this Z information here, unless you hook up your Z through like your curves here, which is totally doable, like you could grab the Z position of the curve of the upper arm or the sleeve peg here. You could connect those two curves to maintain that Z-axis if you wanted to do it this way. But you are going to get that issue of things sliding around and your texture not coming along for the ride. And another way to do it is to create independent textures. So here, instead of sharing this texture with everything, I'm going to create another texture. I just copied and pasted, so this is a clone, but I'm going to give it an independent peg. And then I'm going to connect it to the sleeve and connect that to our cutter system here. If we do it this way, this is what we did similar to where we got our elbow joint with our little arm. We're going to have a texture that moves with our shoulder, so no matter what our movement is. And then you don't need any special thing for the Z because it's connected directly, but we're going to get these hinge joints. So our texture is going to break. So the last thing you might want to do here, if I select the texture, again, it's selecting the actual texture. So what you could do is create a handle that goes above this, so you could select that more easily. Here on your sleeve, let me just check what I have in here. The overlays used, line arts used, color arts used. The underlay is not used at all. So I can create an underlay like this. Boop. And then using our layer selectors, I can isolate the underlay, plug it in like that, and then use a visibility switch and turn off my soft render. So now when I render it, my little dealie is going to disappear. But if I want to select the sleeve directly, I'm not selecting the texture. I can choose texture, or I could choose sleeve. So that's a little bit of a time saver, especially if you happen to have a layer available. Here, if you have everything hooked up to the same texture, and you wanted your whole character to walk along without your texture moving, you just would not connect your texture. So you could have it as large as you want, select your whole character, and then as the character moves around, the texture is going to stay in place, but the character is going to move. So that's just by not connecting your texture to your character. And when he rotates, you're going to get this kind of stuff. Connecting to the chest, you get this stuff where you get floaty textures in the joints. And of course, anything that's not connected to it, like the shoulders here, or this, the sleeve, those are going to have floaty movement when you rotate your joints. Or you can select, you can give each one its own texture, that will move independently, but then you're going to get some weird joints happening. So you can obviously see where we've hinged this shoulder, and as we rotate it, you're going to get broken joints. So hopefully, I was a little bit sloppy. Hopefully I can edit this something useful. For the most part, when using textures, we usually just try and avoid joints. So a character like this, if he had to have texture, he might have a jacket that had some more structure to it. So we have lines where the texture meets the shirt, something like this. And then of course this texture here would be different from this texture on the thing. So like a referee's jersey, there's still going to be issues. So taking textured shirts and raising the arm, for example, is going to be a little bit of a pain because you're going to have to make sure that the texture is working out here under the armpit and stuff. I mean, you tackle each problem as it comes along. I definitely consider this an advanced rigging technique, adding textures to a full character rig. Alright, so hopefully that was entertaining, or at least educational, or a little bit of both or something. If you guys have tutorials that you want, ask them, like leave a comment down below, because I don't know what to do. I'm coming up with ideas last minute and throwing the stuff together. So if you have things you want to see, compositing or rigging or animation, those are sort of my wheelhouse. Ask away. And if I don't know the answer, I will go ask my friends who work in the department that you guys are looking for. That's it. I'm gonna go. Like, share, subscribe, all those things internet people ask you to do. And I'll see you in the next episode, which is a mystery. It's a mystery to us all.